crowd had gathered inside the Grand Texas Martial Arts Center, a place echoing with cheers, flashing cameras, and the sound of legends being celebrated. Reporters lined up, fans waved posters, and the spotlight followed one man, Chuck Norris. The hall was buzzing with respect and admiration as he took the stage, calm yet powerful, his presence commanding every eye in the room. But in the corner, away from the noise, a quiet figure entered through the side door. No red carpet, no entourage, no media attention. Just an old leather jacket, a slow, confident walk, and eyes that carried decades of experience. It was Clint Eastwood. He didn't announce himself. He didn't have to. But in a world obsessed with appearances, silence often goes unnoticed. As Clint found a seat in the back row, a young security guard frowned. "Hey, sir, that section's reserved for VIPs, he muttered. Clint gave a polite nod. "That's fine, son. I'm not here for attention." The guard walked off, but the whisper had already reached the wrong ears. From the stage, Chuck Norris glanced toward the back. He noticed the man sitting quietly, almost blending in with the shadows. He couldn't recognize him from that distance. The lights, the angle, the jacket, everything hid Clint's identity. To Chuck, it looked like some random stranger had just strolled into his private event. He leaned toward one of the staff members and asked, "Who's that guy sitting there?" The staff shrugged. "No idea, sir." He just walked in. "Might be a fan." Chuck's expression hardened. "Security," he said calmly. "Remove him." For a moment, the music continued, the lights kept flashing, but those words cut through the noise like a blade. Two guards nodded and began walking toward the quiet man in the back. Cameras turned, whispers started, and the crowd began to sense something was about to happen. Clint looked up, calm as ever, as the guards approached. He didn't stand, didn't flinch, didn't speak. He simply stared ahead with that same composed stillness, the kind only a man who's seen too much can carry, and in that silence, everyone felt it. Something about this wasn't ordinary. No one knew who he was. Not yet. The two guards marched toward the back row, their heavy boots echoing across the marble floor. The once lively atmosphere turned uneasy. Laughter faded. Conversations died mid-sentence, and all eyes slowly drifted toward the man in the leather jacket who sat perfectly still. The guard stopped beside him. "Sir, this area is reserved for VIP guests only. We'll have to escort you out," one of them said firmly. Clint Eastwood looked up, his gaze steady, calm, and unreadable. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said quietly. "I'm just here to watch the event." The guard folded his arms. "Rules are rules, sir. We can't make exceptions." From the stage, Chuck Norris continued to watch. His jaw tightened slightly. He was a man of discipline and structure. Rules mattered to him. In his mind, the stranger in the old jacket had crossed a line. Without hesitation, he gave a subtle nod to the guards, a signal that meant only one thing: get him out. The crowd sensed the tension. Phones began to rise, flashes blinking like lightning in a storm. A few people whispered nervously, trying to figure out what was happening. But Clint didn't move. He looked at the guards and said calmly, "You don't have to do this, son. Sometimes the man you're pushing away might be the one who built the place you're standing in." The guard frowned, uncertain whether to laugh or take him seriously. "Sir, please don't make this difficult." Chuck finally stepped off the stage. The entire hall went silent. The master himself was walking toward the commotion, each step echoing with authority. His expression was calm, but his presence demanded obedience. People whispered, "Chuck's going there himself." Someone else said, "That guy's in big trouble now." When Chuck stopped a few feet away from Clint, the air between them grew heavy. Two legends standing face to face. Though only one of them realized it, Chuck crossed his arms. "Sir, this is a private event. Guests were invited. You weren't." Clint simply smiled, a soft half-smile that didn't challenge, didn't submit. Didn't know respect came with an invitation. The crowd gasped quietly. A few cameras zoomed in. One could feel the tension flicker like electricity through the room. Chuck's expression stayed firm. "Security, please do your job." But before the guards could move, an older event organizer rushed in out of breath holding a clipboard. "Mr. Norris, sir, just a second." He glanced toward Clint, his eyes suddenly going wide. His hand trembled slightly as he whispered, "Wait, is that?" Chuck frowned. Is that what? The organizer hesitated, lowering his voice. That's Clint Eastwood. For a moment, time froze. The weight of those words hit the air like thunder. People around gasped. Some stood up from their seats, others whispered in disbelief. Cameras began clicking wildly as the realization spread from one row to another like a wave. Chuck turned his head slowly, looking again at the man in the leather jacket. Clint met his eyes, still calm, still unbothered. Chuck's stern expression softened just a bit, confusion flickering behind his steady gaze. You're Eastwood? Clint gave a slow nod. Last time I checked, the room was now silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the lights above them. Security froze where they stood, realizing the mistake they had almost made. Clint leaned back slightly in his chair. You know, Chuck, sometimes the loudest man in the room isn't the strongest. It's the one who doesn't need to shout to be heard. Chuck looked at him, not with anger, but with reflection. He understood that tone. He'd lived that truth in his own way. Still, pride is a hard thing to swallow, even for legends. He straightened up, nodded slowly, and said quietly, I didn't recognize you. Clint shrugged. That's all right. Most people don't recognize respect until it's too late. The line hit deep, not just for Chuck, but for everyone in the room. The audience stayed silent, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, in true Eastwood fashion, he simply tipped his head slightly and said, I didn't come here for attention, partner. I came to support the cause. The organizer stepped forward quickly, trying to smooth things out. Mr. Eastwood, we're honored to have you here, sir. Please allow us to move you to the front. Clint stood slowly, adjusted his jacket, and replied, The back row suits me fine. You see more clearly from here. That one line. It was enough to humble 1,000 egos. The cameras kept rolling, capturing a moment that no one would forget. A moment when silence spoke louder than pride, and calm respect defeated arrogance. The tension in the hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone could feel it. The air, the silence, the weight of what just happened. Chuck Norris stood a few feet away from Clint Eastwood. Eyes narrowed, shoulders squared, the embodiment of command. Clint stood calm, steady, untouched by the noise or the glares. It was a meeting of two titans, not fists but philosophies. Chuck took a slow breath and stepped closer. You could have said who you were, he said firmly, voice low enough for only a few to hear. Would have saved a lot of confusion. Clint's lips curved slightly, that half smile that carried more wisdom than a dozen speeches. If a man needs a name to earn respect, then respect doesn't mean much, does it? The crowd whispered, some nodded, some looked uneasy. No one had ever spoken to Chuck Norris like that before, but Clint didn't say it with arrogance. He said it with quiet conviction, the kind that made people question themselves. Chuck's eyes tightened. This isn't about respect, he replied. It's about order. Clint's gaze didn't waver. Order without respect is just control. The silence deepened. Cameras clicked again, catching every second, every line, every subtle shift in expression. The two men stood locked in a moment of tension that could have snapped at any second. A younger fighter in the crowd whispered to his friend, Man, this is intense. His friend nodded. Yeah, feels like something bigger than an argument. Up on the stage, the event lights dimmed slightly, leaving both men in a spotlight they hadn't asked for. Chuck turned slightly toward the audience and spoke, his voice steady but edged. This event was meant to celebrate discipline, not disruption. Clint stepped forward just one pace. His boots echoed on the polished floor. And discipline starts with how you treat people who can't offer you anything in return. A ripple moved through the audience, the kind that happens when truth hits. Even Chuck's team of organizers looked at each other, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The guards who had approached Clint earlier looked down, uneasy. They realized they'd been seconds away from humiliating the man who had actually made the event possible. But Clint didn't look at them. He didn't need to. His words already carried the weight of forgiveness, quiet, unspoken, but felt. Chuck, meanwhile, was struggling with something deeper, not anger, but reflection. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. All his life, he'd been respected automatically. But now, standing before Eastwood, he felt something rare, humility pressing against pride. He tried to deflect. You came here unannounced, unregistered. What did you expect me to think? Clint tilted his head slightly. That maybe an open door means anyone's welcome. The line struck again. Not loud, not cruel, just simple truth. The crowd broke into quiet murmurs. Some clapped softly. Others just stared. Chuck exhaled slowly, eyes dropping for a second before lifting again. You know, Clint, he said finally, voice lower, more grounded. You and I, we come from the same school of toughness. But times change. People today, they need order to keep things together. Clint nodded. True, but order without compassion turns men into machines. That one hit deep. Deeper than anyone expected. Chuck didn't answer right away. He just stood there thinking while the audience held its breath. Then, in a move that surprised everyone, Clint took the check from his pocket, folded, old, slightly crumpled, and placed it on the nearest table. That's my donation to your charity, Chuck, he said softly. You don't owe me an apology. Just promise me one thing, and next time don't judge a man before you know who he is. The crowd reacted instantly. Some gasped. Others began clapping, slowly at first, then louder. It wasn't the kind of applause that comes from excitement. It was the kind that comes from understanding. Chuck looked at the check, then back at Clint. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he sighed, deep, genuine, human. You've made your point, he said finally. And I deserved that. Clint nodded once, the gesture small but full of meaning. We all make mistakes, partner. The lesson's what counts. And with that, he turned and walked back toward his seat. Calm, unbothered, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than words. The cameras captured every second of it. The image of Chuck standing in quiet realization while Clint sat back down became the moment everyone would remember. Because sometimes, the hardest battles aren't fought with fists, they're fought with humility. The applause started slowly, hesitant, unsure, and then grew stronger, louder, rising like a wave that rolled through the hall. For a moment, it didn't sound like celebration. It sounded like respect rediscovered. People weren't clapping for fame. They were clapping for truth. Chuck Norris stood motionless, eyes still fixed on the check Clint Eastwood had left on the table. It wasn't the money that struck him. It was the message behind it. A man who had been insulted, disrespected, and nearly thrown out had chosen humility over ego. That realization hit hard. The noise of the crowd faded into a soft hum as Clint quietly leaned back in his seat again, hands folded calmly in his lap. He didn't look around for approval. He didn't smile or nod. He just watched the stage, his gaze steady like nothing unusual had happened. Up front, the event host whispered to Chuck, Sir, should we continue? Chuck didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath and said quietly, Yeah, but let's do it differently. He turned toward the crowd, microphone in hand. The hall went silent. Every camera focused on him, waiting to hear what he'd say next. Chuck's voice came out calm, almost heavy. You know, he began, I've been in a lot of fights in my life. Some I won, some I lost. But every now and then, you face one that's not about fists. It's about pride. He looked toward Clint, their eyes met again. And today I realized pride can blind even the strongest man. The audience listened, spellbound. No one moved. Even the security guards who had almost escorted Clint out stood frozen. Their heads slightly bowed, Chuck continued. We live in a world where people wear respect like a badge, only showing it to those they think deserve it. But real respect doesn't need a name or a title or a reason. It should be automatic. A few people in the audience began nodding. Someone whispered, He's right. Chuck set the microphone down for a second, stepped off the stage, and walked straight toward Clint. The cameras followed him every step of the way. Reporters leaned forward, flashes popping. When he reached Clint's seat, Chuck paused. Mr. Eastwood, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. I made a judgment call I shouldn't have made. Clint looked up, not with anger, not with pride, but with that same steady calmness that had carried him through every moment of his life. Takes strength to admit when you're wrong, he said. Chuck nodded slowly. Takes wisdom to remind someone of it without making them feel small. That line hit like a thunderclap, soft but powerful. The two men shook hands. For a split second, the tension that had filled the hall evaporated, replaced by something stronger, mutual respect. The crowd erupted in applause again, this time louder, more genuine. Reporters rushed forward, shouting questions, cameras flashing nonstop. But neither man cared for attention. One of the younger fighters nearby, a kid in his 20s dressed in a crisp white guy, whispered to his friend, That right there? That's what strength looks like. The friend nodded, eyes fixed on the two legends. Yeah, not in punches, in humility. As the noise settled, Chuck gestured for Clint to join him on stage. At first, Clint shook his head, but Chuck insisted, saying, "You belong up there as much as I do." Reluctantly, Clint stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked forward. The audience parted to let him pass. Every step echoed through the hall, slow, deliberate, heavy with meaning. When he reached the stage, Chuck took the microphone again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice strong but warm. "Some of you came here today to watch martial arts, but what you've witnessed is something much greater. A lesson in character." He turned toward Clint. This man didn't walk in demanding respect. He earned it, quietly, calmly, with dignity. That's what real strength looks like. The hall filled with applause again. Some stood, clapping hard, others wiping away tears they didn't expect to shed. Even the guards who had confronted Clint earlier now stood with their heads low, clapping softly. Clint leaned slightly toward the microphone. His voice was low, steady, but carried across the entire hall. "Respect doesn't come from what you say," he said. "It comes from how you act when no one's watching, or worse, when everyone is." The hall went completely silent after that. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everyone knew no words could top that truth. For a few seconds, all you could hear was the quiet sound of people breathing, reflecting, thinking. Then, as the applause returned, Chuck smiled faintly, nodding toward Clint. Two men, two legends, standing side by side. Not as rivals, not as icons, but as examples, because sometimes the most powerful reaction isn't anger or argument. It's realization. And that day, every person in that room, including Chuck Norris himself, walked away with a little more humility in their heart. The crowd's applause still echoed when the hall doors swung open with a sharp, metallic creak. Everyone turned their heads. A gust of cold air rushed in, followed by the sound of footsteps, quick, determined, echoing against the marble floor. 3 men in suits entered, carrying a thick folder of documents. They looked tense, scanning the room as if searching for someone important. When their eyes landed on Clint Eastwood, they hurried forward, weaving through the crowd. "Mr. Eastwood, sir, we've been looking for you everywhere," one of them said, slightly out of breath. The room went dead silent again. Chuck turned, surprise flickering in his eyes. You're here for him?" The man nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Mr. Eastwood just finalized the full acquisition this morning. He's now the primary sponsor and stakeholder of this entire event, including the center itself." Gasps rippled through the audience. The reporters nearly fell over themselves trying to capture the moment. Security froze mid-step. The same guards who had been ready to remove Clint earlier now stood rigid, eyes wide in disbelief. Clint didn't react. He didn't need to. His calmness said more than 100 speeches ever could. He simply looked at Chuck and gave a quiet nod. Not of victory, but of understanding. Chuck's face shifted from shock to respect. He removed his hat and said softly, "You owned this place, and you still sat in the back row?" Clint's voice was steady, deep, almost like a whisper that reached every corner of the room. Ownership doesn't make a man better than anyone else. Respect does. The audience broke into applause again, louder this time, filled with awe. Phones were raised, cameras recording, social media streams exploding in real time. Chuck exhaled, shaking his head with a smile. "You could have walked in with a red carpet and a dozen photographers, Clint. Why stay quiet?" Clint shrugged slightly. "Because a man's character is measured when no one knows his name. I didn't come here for praise. I came to see if the word respect still means something." The crowd erupted again, but Clint raised a hand, calming them. "Before you clap," he said, "ask yourself this. Do you respect people only when you recognize them, or do you respect everyone because it's the right thing to do?" The question hit hard. You could see people looking at each other, some lowering their heads, some nodding in thought. He continued, "I wasn't testing anyone. Life just has a way of showing us who we really are, when no one's watching. And sometimes it shows us who we could be, when we choose humility over pride." He paused for a moment, letting the silence breathe. Then he added, "So tell me, if you were in Chuck's place, what would you have?" The crowd responded with a mix of cheers and reflection. Some shouted, "Respect!" Others simply clapped quietly, moved by the truth in his words. Chuck took the microphone again, turning to the audience. "You heard the man," he said with a grin. "Comment below and fire or forgive. What would you do if you were in my boots?" Laughter and applause filled the air again, but it wasn't mockery. It was warmth, the kind that comes when people witness something genuine. Chuck turned back to Clint. "You've taught me something today, old friend. Not with fists, but with grace." Clint gave that faint, knowing smile. "Lessons don't need to hurt to be remembered." Reporters shouted questions from the sides. "Mr. Eastwood, why didn't you reveal your ownership earlier?" "Mr. Norris, how do you feel about what just happened?" But both men ignored the noise. They were beyond headlines. This wasn't about fame, and it was about legacy. Clint looked around the hall one last time. "This place," and he said, "isn't built on walls or trophies. It's built on respect, the kind that should flow from the janitor to the champion. Because once you lose that, all the strength in the world means nothing." The entire room rose to their feet, a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Some clapped, some cheered, and a few just stood there silent, reflecting on the truth they'd witnessed. Chuck extended his hand once more. "You've got my respect, Clint, always." Clint nodded. "And you've got my friendship, Chuck. Just keep the doors open for everyone." Chuck smiled. "You have my word." As Clint turned to leave, cameras followed him, flashes lighting up the hall. But even then, he didn't look back. His steps were slow, steady, unhurried, the walk of a man who needed no validation. And as the doors closed behind him, Chuck turned to the audience and said softly, "Remember this moment. Because one day you might be sitting in the back row, and the world will see what kind of person you really are. Now it's your turn. Would you have recognized true greatness if it walked past you quietly?" The next morning, the Texas Martial Arts Center stood silent. The echoes of last night's thunderous applause had faded into a calm, almost sacred stillness. Reporters had left. Cameras were gone. The banners were being taken down. But something in the air had changed. A quiet shift that couldn't be seen, only felt. Chuck Norris arrived early, long before anyone else. He walked through the empty hall, his boots clicking softly against the floor. The sunlight filtered through the glass panels, illuminating the very spot where Clint Eastwood had stood the night before. Chuck stopped there for a moment, just looking at the empty chair in the back row, the one Clint had chosen. He took a deep breath. "Guess you were teaching me something all along, weren't you, Clint?" he said under his breath. A janitor sweeping nearby looked up, surprised to hear Chuck talking to himself. Chuck smiled gently and walked over. "Hey," he said, "you were here last night, right?" The janitor nodded. "Yes, sir." Hard to forget something like that. That man, Mr. Eastwood, he didn't just talk. He made everyone feel something. Chuck nodded. "Yeah, he made me feel small. But not in a bad way. In the kind of way that makes you want to be better." The janitor grinned. "That's what real strength does, sir. It doesn't break you. It shapes you." Those words stuck with Chuck all day. By noon, he gathered the staff and security team for a quick meeting. The same guards who had nearly escorted Clint out stood nervously in the corner. Chuck looked at them, not with anger, but with reflection. "Yesterday," he began, "we made a mistake. We judged a man because we didn't recognize his face. That's not who we are supposed to be. Respect isn't something you give to people with money or fame. It's something you give because it's right." He paused and glanced toward the back of the hall again. "That man came here to remind us of that, and I don't ever want us to forget it." The guards nodded silently. One of them spoke softly. "Sir, we're sorry." "We didn't know," Chuck smiled faintly. "Neither did I, son. But that's the point, isn't it? To learn." That afternoon, Chuck made a decision. He ordered that the back row seat Clint Eastwood had sat in would never be removed. Instead, a small brass plaque was placed on it. The inscription read, "Reserved for the quiet ones, those who lead without needing to be seen." The next week, visitors noticed the plaque. Some took pictures, others simply paused to read it. And slowly, a quiet culture began to form within the center. One built on humility, discipline, and respect, just as Clint had intended. A few days later, Chuck received a handwritten note. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable, simple, sharp, elegant. It read, "You didn't have to apologize, Chuck. You just had to understand." Strength isn't in the fist, it's in the choice not to use it. Clint. Chuck smiled as he folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. You're still teaching me, old man, he whispered. That evening he called a small press conference. The hall was packed again. Journalists, students, veterans, and fans. Chuck took the stage and spoke plainly. Last week I almost threw out a man who built this place with his own hands, he said, and that mistake taught me more than any black belt ever could. We live in a world where people shout to be seen, but Clint Eastwood reminded me that real power doesn't need to shout. The room was silent, every camera focused. Chuck continued. So from today onward, every student who trains here will start with one simple rule. Respect before recognition. You want to be strong? Start by being kind. The audience erupted in applause. Reporters scrambled to share his words. Hashtags began to trend. But for Chuck, it wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about carrying forward a lesson that could outlive fame. Later that night, as Chuck stood outside watching the sunset, a thought crossed his mind. A memory of Clint's calm voice. A man's silence can sometimes speak louder than a crowd's applause. Chuck smiled. The horizon burned orange and gold, and for a brief moment, it almost felt like Clint was standing there beside him, silent, watching, approving. He whispered to the wind, "Thank you, partner." And somewhere far away, Clint Eastwood, sitting quietly on a wooden porch, glanced at his phone. A live clip played of Chuck's speech. He smiled faintly, then turned the phone face down and looked out at the setting sun. No spotlight. No cameras. Just peace. Because for men like Clint Eastwood, the legacy isn't in being seen. It's in being remembered for the right reasons. What did you learn from this story? Comment respect if you believe true greatness doesn't need recognition. And share this story, because someone out there might need to be reminded that humility is the loudest strength of all. The sun dipped low over Los Angeles, painting the sky in amber and gold. Clint Eastwood sat quietly on the porch of his old wooden cabin, the same one where he'd written so many of his film scripts and reflected on life between projects. The world was noisy again, headlines, posts, short clips, all echoing one name, Clint Eastwood. But Clint didn't care about the noise. He wasn't chasing it. He never did. He simply sipped his black coffee, eyes on the horizon, the wind brushing against his hat. The incident with Chuck Norris had gone viral. Millions had watched it, not for the drama, but for the message hidden beneath it. It wasn't about pride or who was tougher. It was about something far greater, what it truly means to be strong in a world that worships appearances. Days later, Clint received a video message. It was from Chuck Norris. The frame opened with Chuck standing in the very same hall, beside the brass plaque Clint had unknowingly inspired. Chuck spoke slowly, sincerely. "Clint, I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I wanted to say thank you. You reminded me that leadership isn't about being followed. It's about walking right, even when no one's looking." He smiled slightly, then added, "You showed me that humility isn't weakness and it's wisdom in its purest form." Clint watched the message in silence. A faint smile formed across his weathered face. "Well," he murmured, "looks like the cowboy learned something after all." He turned his gaze back to the horizon. A hawk glided overhead, wings spread wide, effortless, calm, and free. It reminded him of an old truth. Power isn't in the noise you make. It's in the calm you keep. Across the world, people began quoting Clint's lines. Order without respect is just control. Strength isn't in the fist. It's in the choice not to use it. Those words echoed far beyond a single moment. They became reminders for workplaces, schools, and even families. Comment sections were flooded with one word, respect. People shared their own stories, of janitors who taught them humility, of strangers who showed kindness when no one else did, of moments when staying silent took more courage than speaking up. It was more than a viral story now. It had become a movement of thought. Back in Texas, Chuck began hosting a new segment at his training center every Friday evening. They called it the Quiet Hour. During that hour, no one was allowed to spar, talk, or train. They just sat, thinking, reflecting, breathing, learning that silence can be as powerful as strength. Students who once came to learn how to fight were now learning how to forgive. And every session ended the same way. Chuck looking at that brass plaque, then saying softly, "Remember Clint Eastwood, the man who walked in quietly and changed everything." Weeks later, a small charity event took place in California. Chuck attended, unannounced this time. He arrived early, no cameras, no entourage. He just wanted to help out. As he handed food to a homeless veteran, a voice behind him said, "Didn't expect to see you here, partner." Chuck turned around. Clint was there, wearing the same worn jacket, calm as ever. For a moment, both men just looked at each other. No tension, no pride, just mutual respect. Then they laughed, the kind of laugh only old warriors share. "Thought I'd return the favor," Chuck said. Clint nodded. "Looks like you already did." The two shook hands, and for the people watching nearby, it was more than just a handshake. It was history meeting humility. A journalist who happened to be present quietly filmed the moment. That clip would later circle the globe with the caption, "Two legends. One lesson. Respect is the strongest weapon." That night, Clint returned to his porch once again. He watched the stars emerge one by one. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of an owl broke the stillness. He thought about how strange life was, how a simple misunderstanding at a bank, or an argument at an event, could end up teaching millions about human decency. He whispered softly, "Maybe the world just needs reminders." Then as he leaned back, he muttered the words that summed up everything he believed. "Fame fades. Power shifts. But respect, that's forever." Do you believe respect still matters in today's world? Comment yes, respect below. If you think humility is the strongest form of strength. Follow for more true life stories of wisdom, courage, and the quiet power of doing what's right, even when no one's watching.